The Celluloid Closet.
Hairy beasts, amen.
Hey everyone, I'm John and welcome to Let's Talk. Today we're here to talk about part 2 of Sony Pictures Classics 4K Blu-ray set that came out at the end of last year. And more specifically, we're going to be talking about the second film in that collection, The Celluloid Closet. But before we dive into that review, if you are a fan of 4K Blu-ray reviews, movie reviews, some tech and game reviews along the way, nothing helps out the channel more than by you liking this video and subscribing to the channel. So before we dive into that 4K Blu-ray review, we're going to talk a little bit about The Celluloid Closet. I believe this is actually the first documentary film we've talked about here on the channel. And this is definitely the first 4K documentary that I have personally ever seen. So The Celluloid Closet was originally released in 1995 and is directed by Rob Epstein and Jeffrey Friedman and is based on the 1981 novel by Vito Russo. And this documentary film is showing you what it was like to be a member of the LGBTQ+ community through all the years of film, starting all the way back at the silent era, all the way through 1995. What all members of that community had to deal with, how film depicted homosexuality and the trans community, all through the entire history of film. And this documentary features a bunch of talking heads. The most famous that I could recognize were Whoopi Goldberg and Tom Hanks and Harvey Fierstein from Mrs. Doubtfire and Independence Day, who I just love that guy. And this is a very important documentary film for people who aren't aware of what the Hays Code is or how the LGBTQ+ community was treated throughout history of film. Starting all the way back at the silent era, we couldn't even show that on film, so there was always subtext. Even all the way through the 1950s, if you were depicting a homosexual character on film, you had to show them either dying or being the villain, but it was never depicted as a real human. They were always over-the-top cliches, caricatures of what real people were. They were seen always as less than the regular person in the film. So if a screenwriter or a writer wanted to depict a real life acceptable as a real member of the community, as a real human being, the writer or the screenwriter would have to depict that character through like subtext. It had to be kind of like you had to read between the lines that that person was a homosexual. So if you happen to actually be a homosexual in the 50s and you wanted to see yourself on screen, because the thing about film is we all like to try and see ourselves through characters. Unfortunately, the way members of this community were treated through the entire 50s and 60s, 20s, 30s, as far back as you can remember, they were never depicted correctly. It always made members of that community feel less than. So they always had to look through the subtext of it all and actually try and find themselves in these films until we finally got past that era in about the 1970s. But even so, we all know that in 2023, this is still something that members of that community are still fighting for, is for equal representation on film, because everybody likes to see themselves in film. That's the biggest thing about movies. We all go to the movies to feel. We all want to relate to a character. We want to know that, we're not alone in this world. And, I can only imagine what it was like going to the movies in the 1950s and you're homosexual and you're watching something on the screen and you're just watching that person be depicted as like one of the worst people in the movie. And, then going home and you probably feel terrible about yourself. I can only imagine that pain that people had to feel. And this documentary film is just trying to show you that so that you can have a better understanding of what other people have to go through in this world. And this film also shows you what the Hays Code was like. I don't know if everyone is aware of what the Hays Code was, but that was a self-inflicted code by Hollywood that all their films had to follow because, certain films wouldn't be allowed to be shown in certain theaters if they depicted certain things, Obviously, religion played a big part in this in the 1940s and 1950s, so they put this code on there where, every film, obviously you couldn't really show kissing, you couldn't show sexual orientation, the villain could never come out on top. They had to follow a very strict code, and it made it really hard on the writers to put in the characters that they wanted to put in, so you really had to read between the lines of what characters were and look for certain tropes if you really wanted to see yourself in these films, and it must have been extremely difficult, and it was probably frustrating, even though we did get a lot of great films from that era. When you look back on it now and knowing what they really had to hold themselves to, it must have been very frustrating at the time. Because this came out in 1995, a lot of the writers at the time, screenplay writers, directors, all talking about the films that they made and how they put that subtext into these films. It's very interesting watching that now because these interviews were taken back in 1995. And actually that did surprise me at first because seeing a young Tom Hanks or a young Susan Sarandon on screen, I was like, oh yeah, it's 1995. So, this is Tom Hanks after Forrest Gump in Philadelphia. Susan Sarandon coming out the same year, I believe, as Dead Man Walking. So, you know, you get that kind of look of them. Whoopi Goldberg, not too long after Ghost, you know, the younger versions of what we see today. And I really enjoyed this documentary. There's a lot of stuff in here that I didn't really know about, and it really taught me a lot of lessons that I had no idea about. Like, I was aware of the Hays Code. I've read certain things about what other actors and actresses had to go through in Hollywood through that era, but I never really looked into, like, what films would put in there about homosexual characters, because I haven't seen every single film of all time. You know, my goal is before I die to see as many films as I possibly can, but I haven't seen them all. So just seeing like what these films were like back in the 30s and 40s, and, you know, I would have missed the subtext personally because I'm just not looking for it. But this documentary really does take you through every single aspect of that. And it's just a phenomenally made documentary. One of the best for sure. It's not my favorite documentary of all time. You know, it's got that standard documentary feel where, you know, you get the talking heads intertwined with clips. And, you know, it feels a little bit like an HBO documentary or just a regular documentary you would see. I wouldn't say it takes it to that next level of documentary where it feels more like a film. Like I was talking about Fire of Love this year, or my personal favorite documentary of all time, The Thin Blue Line, which uses an amazing Philip Glass score on there that I think really helps to push it to a different artistic level. But still, this is an amazing documentary. It's very educational. If you haven't seen it, I can highly recommend it. Now, the only place you can get this 4K, though, is in the Sony Pictures 4K set, so we're going to talk about that right now. We are on to number 2 in our review of the Sony Pictures Classics 4K set. So what we do again, it's in this big, nice, hard box that I really love. I really didn't expect to love this exterior box, but it looks good on my shelf. It really does fit perfectly on there. You open it up, and I like how it opens up like this. Although you can't open it up on your shelf, so you have to take the whole thing off, but it's good material, so you don't really notice. It's the second one in, so you pull out the Celluloid Closet, you close your big box there, and just like Orlando, you get that nice slipcover on there, original slipcover that's only featured in this box set. You know, you get quotes on the front and back. It's got that nice blue Sony Pictures Classics blue on the side here, on both sides. You slide it off. A little bit of different artwork underneath. Instead of it being black, the main color is blue on the slipcover, where it's black on the actual 4K. So if we ever do get a standalone 4K of this, this is probably what it'll look like. You know, you get your regular stats on the back of this one. You pop it open, you get disc design, just one disc, that's going to be your 4K disc. No Blu-ray packing in here, and that's to be expected. And all your extras and everything are going to be on that 4K disc. And the extras aren't really that great. There's some deleted scenes, some short featurettes. Nothing too crazy, and I expected that. I didn't, you know, I thought Orlando was actually a standout in the fact that the amount of extras they had on that. This is more in line with what I expected, but it's also a documentary, so, you know, everything's kind of cut together the way they intended it to be cut together. You just get some deleted interviews on there. So if you want to see some expanded interviews, I think one of them is Tony Curtis. Definitely check that out on there. Now, the visual quality, this has Dolby Vision and HDR10 on it, so it looked gorgeous. Now, it is a documentary film, and it's intertwined with clips from old movies all the way back to the silent film era, all the way through 1995. I believe the latest film that's on there is 1993's Philadelphia, which is a top 10 film of mine of all time. I love Philadelphia. From the first time I ever saw it in high school, I've always been a big fan of Philadelphia. Now, what's really funny about Philadelphia in this is TriStar released Philadelphia. Sony Pictures owns TriStar now, and they're the ones who put out this 4K that came out for its 25th anniversary in 2018, I believe. So, going through all the clips in the film, you know, everything looks like, you know, it's kind of grainy. It's a little bit cleaned up, but, you know, you get the faded look, depending on the age of the film. You know, it's not really restored or anything like that, but when they get to Philadelphia, it's in beautiful 4K. It looks gorgeous. It looks just like the 4K that I own. So you can see that they use their own archives for Philadelphia, but when they had to get archives for other films, it's not as cleaned up as the rest of it. Now, when you have the talking heads on screen, like Whoopi Goldberg or Tom Hanks, you're really paying attention to the backgrounds behind them, because they all look gorgeous, because they're all in Dolby Vision. You know, they got the best lighting shining on them, because, you know, they're just sitting down for an interview, so they set this all up, kind of like how I'm set up to do this, you know, trying to make them look the best as they possibly could, make the backgrounds behind them look as best as they possibly could, and the Dolby Vision does really help to enhance that. You know, it's obviously got some great contrast. The skin looks amazing. I thought Tom Hanks looked the best out of all of them. He was the best lit. Him or Whoopi Goldberg actually were probably the best lit of everybody, as far as Tony Curtis was lit pretty well too. Some of them, you know, a little bit worse than others, but again, you know, This isn't like, we're not talking about set design or anything like that. This is all just strictly based on, you know, these are interviews intertwined with movie clips. So that's pretty much how this is all set up. So the movie clips are not going to look as good as the talking head aspects of this 4K. But for a documentary film in 4K, this is the only one I've ever seen. So by default, it's the best 4K documentary I've ever seen. And, you know, I hope we get more like this. I'm really a big fan of documentary films, and I would love to see them in the best possible way. The audio is just a DTS HD Master Audio 2.0 on here. Nothing special. And again, that's something that's to be expected for a film like this. It's a documentary film, so you're not going to really get many explosions unless they're in those movie clips that we see on screen. So it's really just making sure that the audio sounds crisp and clear, and there's no clicking, there's no like background static or noise or anything like that. Although they did show some old films from like the 1930s and 1940s. And one thing with 4Ks that I've noticed is, you know, we eliminate all that background static and noise. And when I was watching these clips last night, I was like, you know, I kind of miss that a little bit. Like, I know that we want the best audio possible, but I kind of miss watching an old film on TV and having that like background static. I don't know why. Maybe it's just like that's the way I first came to older films that weren't in the best quality. They were in like, you know, on TV for the most part, or I like, you know, rented a VHS or something. So they always like were faded and the audio was never good. So it was actually pretty funny watching these old clips and like the audio isn't cleaned up. And I was like, you know, it's been a long time since I watched an old black and white film with that old audio that we used to get. So I don't know, maybe a little bit nostalgic. So now that we're 2 discs into this 4K set, I can honestly say again, this is another great disc. I wasn't as blown away by this as I was with Orlando, but again, you know, this is a documentary film. It's a completely different thing than Orlando, but I'm still so happy I own it. I'm so happy I've seen this. I wouldn't have seen this if it weren't for the Sony Pictures Classic set, so that's another thing that's 2 for 2. I never would have saw Orlando. I never would have saw this. So if you're a film buff and you're a cinephile and you really want to see everything about film, and you want to learn about the history of film, you're going to want to see this documentary. And so far, I can't recommend this set yet, but so far I'm very happy with my purchase of this. And if I was just going to rate this disc alone, I would still give this a really solid 8 out of 10. It's a great disc. I wouldn't mind picking this up had I not picked this up in the Sony Pictures Classic set, because it is something that I want to see and it is of very good quality. But anyway, guys, thank you for joining us here on another episode of Let's Talk. Part 3 should come out a little sooner than Part 2. We had some camera difficulties last week, so that's why we didn't have this come out last week. We had to take a day off, so I couldn't film this last week, so we ended up getting to it this week. So Part 3 should be much sooner, and we should get on a steady schedule of releasing the other films in this set. But anyway, guys, thank you so much for being here with me. We really do appreciate all of your support, and nothing helps out the channel more than by you liking this video, subscribing to the channel, and then telling all your friends.